Statistics South Africa has published updated estimates of the country's gross domestic product following a comprehensive rebasing of the data. The revised GDP data for South Africa adds 550 billion rand to estimates. Now, during this process, Stats SA included new sources of information, improved the compilation methodology, reviewed and refined the classification of economic activities, and updated the reference year. The new base year for the national accounts is 2015. In other words, real GDP is now measured at constant 2015 prices instead of 2010 prices, as was previously the case. As a result, the revised estimate of GDP in 2020 is now over 5.521 billion rand, an increase of 11% compared with the previous estimate. An addition, as I said, of about 550 billion rand in estimated output. The annual growth rate for 2020 was revised from 7% to minus 7% to a negative 6.4%. Now, today's topic is the 2021 rebasing of South Africa's GDP. You are watching Business Edge. Welcome. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. Now joining me from Cape Town, South Africa, is Dr. Christie Viljoen. He's an economist with PwC, that's PricewaterhouseCoopers in South Africa. Christie, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. I know it's afternoon. 12 o'clock has hit South African time, so I'll go ahead and say good afternoon to you. All right, let's start with this. We're seeing a lot of rebasing exercises going on actually across the continent at this point in time. Nigeria is also in the middle of her own. But to set a basis for this conversation, what exactly is the purpose of rebasing when it comes to an economy?
Well, we know that calculating GDP is quite a complicated statistical process. So you need to make sure every now and again that you're still looking at the correct information, using the correct sources, and that you're surveying the correct economic activity. Now, one thing that I used as an example this week when I got this question, so what's different? If we think about just a few years ago, there was no such thing as social media. We didn't have influencers. We didn't have people that were making money from Instagram, Twitter, that kind of thing. So that's something that you now need to incorporate when you try and determine how big your economy is. And it's a regular process. It happens every now and again. In the case of South Africa and many other African countries, it happens every 5 years. That statistics agencies just make sure that they are still looking and measuring the right thing, using the correct sources. And as you said, new sources, new opportunities to do calculations. So this is really, it's a normal thing, but often the impacts are quite big. So that's why it's attracting lots of attention.
All right, so for this particular rebasing that's happening in South Africa, and even for all that might be possible, is there only one method of rebasing that's possible across board? Or are there definitely other measures or other methods that can be looked into? And in particular, what's the significance of benchmarking when it comes to rebasing a nation's GDP?
Well, from a statistical perspective, most of the statistic agencies around the world subscribe to global standards. In other words, the way they calculate their GDP is very similar. And then obviously the way that you rebase and you benchmark your numbers periodically, like we're seeing now, it's also based on a similar methodology to other countries. So to make sure that all the international databases are comparable and to make sure that each country's GDP can, to some extent, be compared to that of another country, they use similar statistical methods. South Africa is one of the leading countries on the continent, and we know that Statistics South Africa also has given support to some of the smaller statistics agencies in Africa to help with these kinds of capacities and skills. So, like I said, it happens often. It's a method that is used, and it's a methodology that is followed quite strictly. So it doesn't often happen that the results are questioned in terms of their quality. More often than not, it gives us a result that economies were actually bigger than we thought. And very few people want to complain about that. It's actually good news when you see the GDP in a more realistic way. So yes, on your question, do we have different methods? There are some little bit variations, but mostly from an international benchmarking perspective, most of the African statistics agencies will be following international best practice for this.
And it's interesting you brought up the bigger picture because South Africa's GDP is now 11% bigger, but we'll get into what that means in real terms for South Africans as they attempt to use the rand, attempt to do business in the economy. So let me pick up one other thing before we sort of get into the nitty gritty. So they're going to release publish the GDP estimates for the second quarter on September the 7th. There's some missing data there. We'll get into that as well because the mining industry is a significant part of South Africa's industry. But they're going to drop, that statistics essay is going to drop a focus on annualized growth and use the 2015 year as the new base year for the comparison of prices. Now, this annualized growth, we've been hearing it for a while as South Africa has been doing its monthly, quarterly rankings and ratings. So what's the difference that you see when it comes to using annualized growth rate compared to picking a base year or updating the base year as it is now to 2015?
So what happened with this annualized number? It's sort of an estimate of the speed of economic growth. It's a quarterly number, but when they say annualized, you sort of look at it over a 12-month period. And we've always had this number. Many other countries in the world also use it. And I think what the big problem was that in the second quarter of last year, when we had a recession, as did many countries in the world, this seasonally adjusted annualized number was just, I almost want to say, completely crazy. It said that the economy contracted by 50%. Now, it didn't contract by 50% in the quarter. It was more a case of about 17%. But if you look at it over a 12-month period, that drop in economic activity would have just been completely terrible if it happened over a 12-month period. So to avoid confusion with this annualized number, to make sure that the numbers that we see in the media and that people look at every quarter when these numbers come out, the annualized number is not going to be as important going forward. We'll be having more, I want to say, more regular quarterly and year-on-year numbers because they then fit in with many other publications coming from Statistics South Africa, where the focus is on monthly, quarterly, and yearly growth rates, percentages that actually compare actual numbers to each other, not really annualized or seasonally adjusted. So it's just making things a little bit simpler because of that confusion that we had in the second quarter of last year.
So let's get into some of the information that's coming out from this rebasing exercise. So it also affects the makeup of South Africa's economy, as you alluded to earlier. So tell us a little bit more. What are the changes, the biggest changes particularly, that you're seeing with this rebasing exercise? And in terms of the expected impact, how do you think the rebasing will affect South Africa's economy?
So one of the interesting points was that the finance and banking and let's call it related services, that industry is actually even bigger than we thought. It's now about 25% of GDP, which is actually good news because over the past 10, 15 years, the finance and banking sector has been very reliable in terms of growth and job creation. It's been one of our star performers. So it's very good news. In the new data, we see the opposite when it comes to government activity. So suddenly it looks like government activity is a lot smaller than it was, but that is based on just new international benchmark for statistics where you previously had the whole of government. Now we're taking out education and healthcare and created a bit separately. It's because not only in South Africa, but globally, you see so much more private sector activity in healthcare and education that it's necessary to have split this out. So that is, it seems strange. Suddenly it feels like South Africa's government activity is a lot smaller. But it's just it's a new way of calculating this. Now, onto the question of how is this impacting South Africa's economy and its outlook. Today, South Africa's economy is very much the same as it was a week ago when these numbers came out. We don't have a drastic change. Everyone's getting up, going to work, getting home in the evening. No real important impact on most South Africans. What it is giving us is giving a better perspective on what the economy is made up of, where the growth has been, and probably where the growth hasn't been. We've had, even before COVID-19, a big challenge in terms of economic growth. For many years, economic growth was below population growth. So you're always taking 2 steps ahead and then 1 back again. And this is giving us a better picture of where the growth drivers are. Like I said, finance and banking looking very good. And it could help us inform future policy, future incentives, future plans on how we get this economy growing much faster, given the challenges that we've had, not only last year, but in the years before that.
So I want you to expand on that point, but because my next question really was going to say, how was this going to affect the South African on the streets and their purchasing power? 11% bigger, that's the GDP, adding about 548 billion to the economy. Those are good numbers. They're good figures. And as you said, no one wants to hear bad news, and everyone will be happy to have a bigger economy. But if you're saying it doesn't really truly drill down to the South African, what then is this going to lead to? So if you talk now about the purposes of planning, so let's expand on that a little bit. What can government do with this number, with the figures, with the updated information that's coming out that can then lead to a positive correlation or impact on the South African on the streets?
Well, yes, the average South African is, I want to say, really not moved by these numbers.
Yeah.
We must remember that this rebasing is on GDP data from 2020 backwards. So we've already lived this. We just didn't know that we were doing exactly this, but we've been through this. We've lived this. It's not going to affect your salary. It's not going to directly affect your taxes. So for the average South African, maybe it's less important than it is for government and analysts like myself. For government, I think it is actually a bit of good news. We've got a large fiscal deficit, government budget deficit, and rising government debt. And you always look at this as a ratio of GDP. Now, if GDP is bigger, that ratio actually looks a little bit better. So when we have our medium-term fiscal budget, which is published late in October, it means that our fiscal numbers will actually look a little bit better. We've also seen higher than expected government revenues over the past few quarters. So overall, I think the fiscal message we get in October will probably be a bit better. And there's the small contribution from the reweighting. In terms of government policy, like I said, it's now more clear to us where the bigger and the smaller sectors are in the economy, where the growth has come from. And as with any government trying to get an economy to grow, you need to provide the correct environment, the correct policies, the correct incentives and stimulus for these industries to grow. So I think what it could help is maybe with the private sector in their talks, in their regular interactions with government, to be able to say, here we are, this is a more accurate reflection of the role that we play in the economy. Let's work on these and these different topics. Let's look at policy. Let's look at incentives. Let's look at foreign investment situation. It's actually a way, like with all statistics, it's a way of empowering people to make better decisions for the betterment of the society.
All right, so let's get to the missing mining data, but that's going to come up right after the break. This is a massive thing on the economic side for South Africa, but there's some very critical data that's missing, and that's data from South Africa's mining sector, which is a very critical driver of the economy. How could this missing data, in fact, affect investor sentiment? What's the larger picture there? And we'll also talk about the possibility of this affecting South Africa's next rating from Fitch. You are watching Business Edge. There is more right after this. This is Business Edge, and we're still looking at the 2021 rebasing of South Africa's economy. My guest is an economist with PwC South Africa, Dr. Christie Viljoen. Christie, let's look at this now. Fitch affirmed South Africa's rating at BB- in May. And with this rebasing, with a new look at the economy, more additional information coming out, do you think that there's possibility of this new information actually influencing the next rating from Fitch? What do you think about that?
Well, the new GDP numbers will definitely improve some of the data that Fitch looks at. So the fiscal deficit, public sector debt, those are the two key ones. The numbers will look better when the next fiscal budget comes out. And I'm sure Fitch will have better numbers as well when they release their next review a bit later this year. I don't think it's going to have a big influence, to be very honest. South Africa's fiscal numbers are not looking good. This will have a small positive impact, not massive. It's not going to change the direction of government spending. It's not going to change the perception on what government spending priorities are. I don't think Fitch will really have a different view on South Africa's medium and long-term debt outlook. In the end, they give us a rating on the probability that government will repay its debt. And I don't think that's going to be fundamentally different with these GDP numbers. A little bit more positive, but not really enough to move the needle on that.
All right, so let's talk about that missing data that everyone is slightly focusing on right now, one of South Africa's most critical sectors. And mining statistics for June were meant to be released in August, but the source data from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy has been delayed. Now, Stats SA said they will use an estimation to arrive at what they think to be the mining sector's contribution to the second quarter GDP. So this gap in information, do you think it's going to affect investor sentiment? Is there any consequence for this delay or for the gap in this information for this particular sector?
So mining it has been for more than a century one of South Africa's most important sectors. At the moment, is not the most important, certainly not. It's still a very big creator or generator of foreign revenue because most of what we mine, we export. And over the past 12 months, mining production and sales has been one of the few positive points that we could really every month be happy about. Mining production went very well, and mining sales have just increased significantly. There's been favorable demand internationally, and there's also been a favorable exchange rate. So mining has been driving our economic recovery from COVID-19. And now we sit with the situation where the data is late. So what happened was that last month, Statistics South Africa was supposed to publish mining production data for June, which is part of the second quarter, which is part of the second quarter GDP calculation. However, Statistics South Africa did not receive that data on time from the relevant ministry. We're hoping it's being released within the next week or two. But basically what it means is that we've got less than ideal set of data to calculate the second quarter GDP number, which is being published next week. Now, Statistics South Africa had said it's not the end of the world. It's not a problem. They will use some estimates, and we know, obviously, for the other 2 months of the third quarter, we know what mining production was, and they'll probably use an estimate based on export revenues to get a number for mining. They've also emphasized that whenever they publish a GDP number, they say that this is a preliminary number. It's not regularly reported that way in the media because it's not on the front page of the report. Well, probably, actually it is, but it's not really given as a first estimate. We know that GDP gets revised quite a few times down the line. So I don't think it's the biggest problem we faced in South Africa in terms of statistics. What it could mean for foreign investors and actually local investors as well, it's about confidence in government processes. The mining data comes from the relevant ministry in the central government, and there's enough debate and challenges and evidence in the South African government about efficiency, about having everything in order, about implementing policy. So this just raises another question about the reliability of statistics and in general paperwork when it comes to these kinds of activities. It raises concern that government just has too much to deal with at the moment, and that some other important things like these statistics, which might not be as important for day-to-day running of government, but for investors, foreign investors specifically, being able to see these numbers influences their decision whether to invest or not. And if you don't know exactly what's going on with production combined with all the other issues, then it gives you a weaker picture of what's going on in the economy, and it reduces your optimism about being able to operate within a certain business environment. So from that perspective, I think analysts are a bit disappointed because it doesn't send a strong positive message about the prioritization of these kinds of numbers, which it's very important for foreign investors. We can't get away from that.
Okay, so something I found quite interesting looking at all this data, based on previous estimates, South Africa experienced 3 quarters of economic decline before the massive hit that the economy, like many others around the world, took because of COVID-19 and national lockdowns. But now, based on these new revisions, South Africa actually recorded a quarter of economic growth in Q4 of 2020 before the impact of the pandemic. This was also the time that the country was exiting the longest recession in 28 years, around this time as well in 2020. So the rebasing seems to bear out that particular exit of the recession. But when you compare the data and then you get this information newly now, you know, earlier on you mentioned that a lot of people use methodology that they make sure cannot really be faulted, so that there's a basic understanding and there's an opportunity to compare across the board. But when you look at something as critical as 3 quarters of economic decline versus maybe a quarter of growth, you do want to ask questions as to how that information or how that conclusion was arrived at. What do you make of that significant change in data, particularly that overlapping period of time?
Yes, look, this is certainly not unique to South Africa. We see that in many other countries as well. When you do these revisions to GDP, you get a little bit of a different picture. And when it gets to a point where there was a small recession or a small bit of growth, you can probably see that inverted once in a while. So, like you mentioned, we were in a recession. Now suddenly it looks like we were not in a recession. When it comes to something like that, then you probably need to look a bit deeper at the numbers. In the case of South Africa, whether we were in a small recession or a small growth period, even if we were seeing positive growth, it was still below the population growth rate, which is something we really need to aim for. So it is obviously of concern that when we look at numbers today, and we know that the next GDP revision is a few years away, that these numbers will look different. It's probably a case of this is the best we have at the moment. We've had these improvements now, so we're working with a new system. It's probably similar to the COVID-19 situation where we are learning as we go along. The GDP estimates have been around for many, many decades, almost 100 years, and we're still learning about it. It's not a perfect statistic, and when you go beyond merely economic activity and you look at socioeconomic well-being and societal well-being, it often gets criticized. It is the best we have at the moment, like I said, and for the next few years, this current rebasing is going to be the way we look at it, with full knowledge that 5 years down the line, we'll be updating it again. Hopefully, we learn every time a little bit more about it, but there's really not much that we can really do about these backward revisions that give us these little surprises about a recession that suddenly wasn't.
Interesting, a recession that suddenly wasn't. All right, so as we wrap up, let me just ask, overall, what has South Africa gained in your estimation from this particular rebasing exercise?
Well, apart from having more accurate data, which is always good when it comes to especially like economists trying to understand where the economy is going, we also know, and I think many more South Africans know, that we follow these benchmark statistical methods it's implemented globally. So it's good news that we are keeping up with this. It's something that wasn't too delayed by COVID-19. I think one of the things that there are many positives and negatives. One of the things I'm concerned with that we need to take away from this and really think about it, given our challenges with job creation, we've got now officially the highest unemployment rate in the world. We are not creating enough jobs. And suddenly now we know the economy is actually bigger than we thought. So the problem is actually even more intense. We were struggling to create jobs, and even in a much bigger economy, that number looks even worse now. So for me, the key takeaway here is that to solve this employment problem, even with a bigger economy, we couldn't do it previously. We need to rethink the situation. We need to rethink how we are going to create jobs. So for me, that's the wake-up call from the GDP data. It's telling us that the few jobs that we are creating, it's actually much less than we should have been.
All right, so we'll end the conversation there. We actually spoke about South Africa's unemployment rates with the ILO director based in Pretoria earlier this week. And it's a conversation we'll continue to focus on the most industrialized economy on the continent, constantly nipping at Nigeria's feet now, even with rebasing data to see who is the largest economy on the continent. But it's a very significant player in sub-Saharan Africa that we need to continue to focus on. Dr. Christie, Viljoen, thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge. I'm very sure we'll be seeing you sometime soon.
Thank you very much.
All right. And so information, data, they say, is power. But who has the data? Statistics SA is going to release the updated estimates for South Africa's GDP and the economy on September the 7th. Any surprises? We might, of course, be following up on that if they do come out. But it's an interesting conversation. If you did miss our conversation on South Africa's unemployment rate, you can go to our YouTube channel where we spoke to the International Labour Organization Director for South Africa on how the country can address a 44% unemployment rate. What we'll be addressing when we come back are the stories we're keeping our eyes on. Stay with us. All right, it's NC4 to watch, and we get started on top of our list today. The foreign exchange reserves held by the Central Bank of Kenya dipped below $9 billion for the first time in 8 weeks. Kenya's forex reserves fell by $203 million to $8.986 billion as of August 26, from $9.189 billion 7 days before. The bank said that the foreign currency reserves are sufficient to cover a little over 5 months of imports, above the bank's statutory requirement. Uganda has protested a 79% cut in its scheduled sugar exports to Kenya, reigniting trade disputes between the two East African countries. Uganda's Agriculture Minister Frank Rebasing says the country is not happy with the restrictions. A deal between the two allowed Uganda to export surplus sugar to Kenya 3 years ago, but Nairobi delayed the implementation until late last year, when Uganda was allowed to ship in 20,000 tons of the 90,000 tons surplus that it had requested. Tanzania has reduced its mobile money levy by 30% because of complaints from users. In June, the Tanzanian government had amended the Electronic and Postal Communication Act by imposing a levy of between 10 Tanzanian shillings and 10,000 Tanzanian shillings on mobile money transactions. The levy took effect on July 15, 2021 and was aimed at raising revenue by about 1.254 trillion Tanzanian shillings to partly finance the 36.68 trillion Tanzanian shilling 2021-2022 budget. And finally on the list, Eskom CEO Adeleru-Balogun has said that there are signs that Eskom is making some headway when it comes to collecting payments from municipalities, which collectively owe the utility about 39 billion rand. Eskom is now working with municipalities and setting up measures to collect money from ratepayers. The CEO added that Eskom seemed to be working, albeit slowly. The state utility is actively working to stop municipal debts from increasing every year. Thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge as we wrap up this week. If you've missed any of our conversations that have looked at the biggest business, financial, and economic stories that are coming out of the continent, make your way to our YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe and look for Business Edge there. You can, of course, also check us out on our social media platforms at News Central TV. And of course, we are live on our websites. We're live on StarTimes Channel 273 and a host of other platforms. I'll be telling you, have a pleasant weekend. Stay safe. And of course, join me Monday morning, 11 a.m. West African time sharp, as we get into the business that's happening on the continent. I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. See you soon.